hive. So this looks like a really great, happy colony right now. And we're gonna go and take a look at these bees because at first it may be hard to see all the detail on this frame. And so what we want to do is like look at things up close, and we want you eventually to get the, kind of visual cues and the recognitions that even if all these bees are moving all over, you can actually see each bee. And that's the thing that's going to be super fun is this goes from being just like a picture of like craziness to then being able to really inspect your hive relatively quickly. Like if you're taking a look at this, you're looking around it, you're trying to see, where your brood is, what's the number of bees, do the bees look like they're more females, are there more males? And that you could probably get in a glance about 10 to 15 seconds once you get familiar with your bees. You can flip it around and then see the other side. And then you go on to your next frame. And so it'll be fun to be able to see this up close and personal and then see this little detail that we're going to see. So we're going to go over the individual parts. So the basic bee anatomy first, just so that you're familiar with that. And this anatomy is going to be very similar to all insects because they are insects. They got their 6 legs. So our honeybees, and we can go through a lot of the little details about the varieties and different species, but honeybees are very unusual. So there are very few species that form large colonies that actually collect and store honey. So I believe there's only 6 different species, and the most common one that we interact with are Apis mellifera, and so it's most bees, so thousands of other species, actually never form large colonies. So these are really unusual insects, but we have cultivated them for many different reasons. And we're going to see why they are good for both pollination and for honey making. So let's take a look at them. And we'll just go from the left to the right so you kind of can see all the different parts. And so you can see their antenna. And the reason why we look at these parts is also to just realize how fragile some of these parts are because they need all of their little parts to be able to be healthy. And also, if you damage any of these little parts, they are going to notice and they're not going to like you for it. So, also just being able to make sure that your bees are happy and healthy is going to be important. So you'll see the antenna, they have this little hinge part here. So they're going to go up and down as they're kind of communicating. They'll actually they can even rub each other. They have these little segments here. Sometimes if a beehive has been handled a little bit roughly, some bees will actually lose some of their antennas. So it's something to look out for. They'll have their mandible. So that's what they're going to use to chew things like wax or to break down different resins that they're forming together, like when they're making propolis. You'll see their big compound eye here. The eyes have hair, like a lot of the bee has a lot of small little hairs for collecting pollen. There's an ocelli, so you have 2 compound eyes on both sides. They're going to be very important in terms of identifying your males from your females. And the ocelli is right at the top, so it's a way for sensing light and being able to like understand their environment. You'll see their proboscis. So that is their tongue. So that's what they're going to use to lap up and also suck up any nectar, also water. So when they're drinking. And then you're going to see there's a little hinge here as we look at the wing. And we'll take a look at the wing in more detail in just a moment. There's going to be 2 sets of wings. So you got wings on the right and the left. And then there's a forewing and a hind wing. And depending on what they're doing, you're going to see them in different positions. So they might be on top of each other when they're trying to emerge from a cell. They might be on top of each other if they're moving past each other in the hive. They might be more open if they're fanning, if they're trying to communicate with pheromones and they're fanning to move, that pheromone into a certain direction. They might be fanning their wings if they're trying to dehydrate the nectar. So they're trying to like create some wind over the nectar. So the wings are very, very important, but they're also very fragile. And this is something when you're working with your bees, the reason why you want to be gentle when it comes to their wings is that if you take a look at their wings from just an engineering standpoint, their wings are relatively small for their size. So you can think of a butterfly or a moth. You can think their wings are actually really large. So they're actually better set up to be able to fly versus honeybees, their wings are smaller. So they actually have to beat their wings really fast. So you can, some people will call them like they can even like hover. So they wind up being almost like helicopters. They can go straight up and down. Whereas if you look at like butterflies, they have these big flappy wings. And so they kind of more like sail around. So it's kind of interesting just to think about that kind of dynamic. But if you take a look at, say, a honeybee that's has become a forager, one of the biggest reasons why when we take a look at their lifespans, they have a very short lifespan, like more closer to 30 days versus say a drone or queen that lives in the hive and never actually uses their wings for much flight. They will have wings that stay intact for a very long time, but a forager will start to get little holes in her wings just from the vibrations and using them and just whatever traveling that she's doing. So as soon as she starts to get little holes in her wings, she actually won't be able to fly and won't be able to get to food and water. And that's why they'll eventually die. And if you take a look at your bees that have died, and if they're foragers in the front of your hive, you can actually see their wings have lots of little holes in them. And so that's something that can be tricky. Now, you can also think about it is if you get those wings wet, or their bodies wet, it makes it also harder for them to fly. So sometimes if you're trying to keep your bees from flying a lot, another alternative to smoke would be to use some sugar water or just plain water. And if you get them just lightly wet, they won't be able to flap their wings. They'll kind of like just settle a little bit more in the hive. So just something to think about as an alternative, or it's a classic thing that we do when we're trying to capture a swarm. You can kind of spritz them with some water, and it's less likely when you shake them into a box that they're going to fly away. But you do have to be very careful about when you're using any water with the bees, because if you look at a bee, bees have what are called spiracles, and spiracles are going to be a line of holes on each of these segments. And what that is, in a sense, it's almost like a mouth, because we have lungs. Bees and insects actually have air tubes. And the air tubes need to like travel throughout the body to be able to deliver oxygen. And so if you get a bee too wet, you'll actually drown a bee, because you'll have all these little spiracles filled with water. So you want to always be careful about using water with bees, because it's a way that you could actually kill a swarm if you spray too much water on them. And we didn't talk about this, but insects will have three different segments. So we kind of talked about the head parts, the thorax, which holds the wings here, and then also the legs. So the two sets of legs are there's like the four, and I forget the different names for these sets, but there's going to be 6 legs total. And then you're going to have this abdomen here. And you can see it's just a small little connection here. Now, when you're taking a look at the bees, say you're trying to look at one type, so a female that's a queen or a female that's a forager. If you look at them, their head and their thorax should look pretty much the same size. But then when you look at their abdomen, the abdomen of the queen is going to be much longer. So that's a little clue when you're taking a look at your bees, how you're going to find the queen. You're going to have a bee that has a very long abdomen, but the head and the thorax is going to look like the majority of the other bees in the hive. And if you look at a male, all the parts are going to be bigger. So the head, the thorax, and the abdomen are going to be bigger. Because sometimes when people are looking at a hive and they're looking at a frame, they think they see a queen because the bee looks bigger, the abdomen looks bigger, but it's actually a drone or a male. Okay. So there's some of the clues to think about. Now, when you take a look at the different legs, you can see that they have the different, like there's a knee, there's segments, and then they actually have little hooks on their end of their little like legs. And so the one thing that you want to know about is that they actually can be pretty sticky. So like if you're wearing gloves, if you're wearing, say, a cotton glove, what will wind up happening is their little feet will get stuck in that glove by accident. Um, if you wind up trying to use maybe like a latex glove or a plastic glove, they won't get stuck as much on your gloves. So that's something else to think about. Also, if you're looking at these little bees, they'll like crawl up you a lot. So also, it's really hard actually to just push a bee away because their little like claws are in your bee suit. So if you're trying to move a bee, sometimes I'll actually just use a leaf or a twig, and you can actually get it underneath the bee, and that will help it kind of get loose. Because if you try to wipe it away, it probably will just get stuck and be actually more irritated if you're trying to brush it. Okay. And again, if you have any questions, go ahead and then shout them out. And then you'll see lots of different hairs on the legs, just like there are on the abdomen. But there are some special spindle hairs on the back legs that make up what's called the pollen basket. And so you'll see these are going to be stiffer and longer hairs, and it's going to be where the bees are going to start to pack in their pollen. And we'll look at that up close and personal. Okay. Now, I wanted to show an up close picture of those wings just to give you a little bit more information, because I always thought that this is really interesting. So you have the forewing and the hind wing, and those two wings need to be attached to each other when the bee is flying, because you need to have enough lift to be able to get that bee up. And so what they do is they have these little hooks, and the hooks are called hemuli. And then what they do is they hook onto the other wing, and then that way they stay together. And so when the bee comes inside and it needs to like lay those wings on top of each other, you're going to unhook them and then lay them on top of each other. There's also this idea of where the wings actually attach to the bee. What'll happen is like there's a little hinge there. And one of the more recent, over the last few years, a bee behavior that's been identified is they can actually unhook their wings. So they can use their same muscles that they use to beat their wings. And if they just vibrate those muscles or contract them in the same way that they're flying, but they're inside the hive and they're detached from the wings, they can actually start to use that muscle like activity to heat up the hive. So they're called heater bees. And so that's another thing that they can do when it's really cold in the winter time. If they're having trouble keeping the brood, which are the baby bees, warm, is they'll start to like start beating their wing muscles without actually having them attached. And then you may notice that there's all the veins here, and this is a typical pattern that's reproduced in, every single honeybee. So they should look very similar from one bee to another. Okay, so there are a few more things that weren't in the other diagrams. So we'll take a look at this. Maybe I'll just point out a couple of different things. So this honey stomach is something that we talk about. So when they're lapping up or sucking up any nectar, it goes into their honey stomach. There they keep it, and then they will come back to the hive, and they actually regurgitate it to another bee so that it can be put into the hive. There's a gland near their pharynx or in their mouth that produces the royal jelly. We talked about the honey basket, which when it's full, it just kind of all this like pollen sticks to their legs. And then there's a wax gland that is excreting the wax that they use to make their comb. And we'll take a look at that a little bit more closely. And then the stinger here, you don't always see. So most bees will have that stinger inside their abdomen, and then it will come out when they need to sting. So we're going to see what that looks like. So this is what a stinger looks like under a magnifying glass in a sense. So you can see it actually is very long and very thin. So it's very much a hypodermic needle. But this actual stinger has three different parts to it. There's a part in the middle, and then which is stationary, and then there's going to be two different parts on the side of that stationary part. And what they do, and this is what has the barbs, is they actually go, there's a little muscle, and it will move the stinger further and further in. And so that's why as soon as you get stung, if you can pull it out before they actually go and like inject themselves into your skin, you can get them off. So most important thing is to try to scratch it out as soon as you can. And you can see here, there's the muscle here that's going to move those little like pieces on the side of the stinger in and out. And then there's going to be a big gland that has the actual venom in it. So that's why if you wind up squeezing it, in a sense, you're just squeezing everything into the little needle that's injecting the venom. So if you can, you want to avoid this. And you actually can see this part. It's hard sometimes to see the stinger very well, but if you see this, you want to not squeeze it. You want to like flick it off as much as possible. Now, the thing about this is I got the stinger off my glove. And if you see a bee and it stung you, and this little stinger is in your finger, there are barbs that are going to keep that stinger in place. So what'll happen is if the bee flies off, sometimes you'll see a bee that looks like it's flying, but it's still like stuck to you. And there's this little string, in a sense, something that you can see that's white. That's this white thing here. And that's actually part of their intestine. And so if they've already pulled that out, in a sense, they won't be able to survive without their intestine. So they'll still be able to fly for a little bit. They'll be able to fly off. So sometimes if I see that a bee has already stung me, I just kind of squish them so they don't have a slow death. They just kind of are already destined to die. But that's, if you see this little like string, that means that their intestines have come out. Now this is going to be specific for the females that are not the queen. Now the queen is going to have a stinger similar to the other, workers and foragers, but it doesn't have any barbs. And so that means it can't get stuck. And that's why a queen, what she'll do is she takes her stinger and she uses it to kill other queens. So when you have more than one queen cell, which is where a queen's going to emerge and develop, um, the first queen that comes out, the thought is that she goes and she will go and like kill every single other queen that emerges. Okay, so that's why we think that it's really rare to be able to ever see more than one queen in a hive because they don't tolerate it. I have seen one queen that had two queens in it. Not quite sure why. Maybe one was going to die or not. But it's usually pretty rare. But if you have a stinger that doesn't have a barb, they can sting over and over again, like wasps. Okay. And then the stinger is part of like the oviduct. So she can also like deposit eggs as part of this. And so a male bee doesn't have an oviduct, and so it doesn't have a stinger. So that's why you can handle a bee. You can actually show other people a male bee or a drone, and you can be confident that they're not going to get stung because they don't have a stinger. Okay. All right. So we kind of looked at all those bee parts. So hopefully now when you're taking a look at this picture, maybe you see a few things that maybe you might not have recognized before. One thing that I think that's always kind of nice to see is you can see how the hind wing and the forewing are laying on top of each other. So they've unhinged. You can see, sometimes you can even see like the little part of the, almost like there's a little hinge where you can see the wing that's inserting. You can see the placement of the compound eyes. And this is something I think that's helpful to get used to because the placement of the compound eyes in terms of like how they meet at the head is very different between the females and the males. And we'll see a male in a little bit, but if you were to look at the female, they have a little bit of space in between those compound eyes. That's going to be different. This maybe those eyes look a little bit bigger, but there's still like some space in between them. So these are all females here. The other thing that's important to kind of start to look at when you're looking at your bees is, are the bees, on top of the honeycomb, or are they actually inside the honeycomb doing things? This is important because if you see this bee down here, the head is actually inside the cell. Now, if there's nectar in there, that means that bee, if you're smoking your hive, they will actually be concerned that the beehive might be in danger if there's a fire nearby. And so the reason why you smoke your bees is like they actually, think that something is happening that's detrimental to the hive, they'll start to drink some of the nectar. And if you've smoked your hive well enough, you'll see a lot of these little bee butts sticking out because they're just drinking nectar, and then they get heavier so they can't fly as fast. And then, some people think that it makes them a little bit more docile if they have a honey stomach that's full of honey. And you can see how fuzzy they are. You can see their antennas are looking good. So this is a really healthy set of bees right here. Now, when we were taking a look at the bees in the hive, they look very clean. They should look clean. If you see bees, and you've probably seen this before, is like if you have a bee that's on a flower with a lot of pollen, the bee should look really fuzzy, and they will have a lot of pollen collecting all over them. So that kind of like static electricity from having their hair will attract a lot of pollen, and then they'll also just kind of move around the flower so that more and more pollen collects on their hairs. And then what they'll do is they'll start to groom themselves, and they will start to pull all of the pollen together, and they start to make little balls. And so they are going to pull all that pollen off, and then they're eventually going to stick it back into their pollen basket. And they're going to start to pack it just bit by bit, because it needs to stick to each other, and it needs to stick to their spindle hairs in their pollen basket. Okay, and so this is like a common picture of a bee that's foraging for pollen. Now, a bee can forage for pollen and for nectar, but sometimes they just do one or the other. And so you'll see bees coming back that have pollen, and you'll see bees that don't have any pollen, so they're coming back with nectar. Like a bee doesn't just go out and come back with nothing. They're doing it for a reason. They're foraging for something.
You're gonna see them, or do you have any pictures of them collecting nectar?
Yes, that's going to come up in just a moment. Hang on one second. And I don't have all these pictures, but another thing that you'll see if you're looking at them using their proboscis is if you want to see that at your hive, you can stick a little bit of water, or you'll see it if you break any of um, the honeycomb. If nectar starts to flow in your hive just from the inspection, you'll start to see them lapping it up. And so that's another thing that you'll be able to see really easily. Um, let's see. So this is after the bee has collected the pollen, she's wiped it off her body, and she's packed it. And these pollen baskets can be pretty big. Um, and you can see this one's even bigger. And it's just kind of a nice activity to be able to see the activity of your bees over the seasons, from like spring to summer to fall to winter, because they're going to be bringing different types of pollen back. They're going to be bringing more nectar during what we call the nectar flow that starts in the end of January, beginning of February. So these are all things that you can start to like look at when you're inspecting your bees. So like right now, springtime, when we have a lot of like high pollen counts, you should be seeing a lot of pollen being brought back to the hives. So it's kind of fun to kind of start to gauge what's happening in nature around you by what your bees are doing. Um, and then another thing that you'll see is, this is maybe a darker type of pollen. So depending on what type of plant they're foraging from, you'll see that they come back with one type, one color. So once they identify a location, they're usually going to forage in that location and come back and forth. And so they'll be collecting from usually one type of flower, versus like, collecting in like one area from multiple different ones. They usually kind of stick to like a tree or something. So a lot of people will say like, I forget the name of the tree. I think it's like an African tree. I'm forgetting the name of it. It's got like a lot of little yellow flowers on it. So some people will find that there's so many bees on this particular this tree collecting pollen that they actually think a swarm is formed because there are just so many foragers around it. But it's kind of fun to see. Sometimes the packets of pollen are so big that the bees have to waddle. And so you see them kind of waddling back and forth as they walk on the front of the entrance. So that's kind of fun to see, kind of silly. Now, when they bring the pollen back, what they're going to do is they're going to then pull it off, and then they're going to pack it into one of the cells. And so you can see even just a small little packet of pollen, it's a very small amount. So they're just coming back and forth, and they're adding multiple trips to each of these little cells to fill up the pollen. And you can see like there's pollen that's been deposited, and then you can see this other cell that looks a little bit more almost like pasty. And so if you want to try to eat the pollen, you'll actually tell a difference between pollen that's fresh. It can kind of have, I don't know if you can call it like, what's the best way to put it? It does taste floral, whereas when you see this pasty pollen, it's what we call bee bread. And so it's pollen that's fermented. And so when you eat it, it does taste a little bit sour. And so you need to have some fermented bee bread in here so that the bees will use that to feed the developing bees or the developing larvae too. So this is what it's going to look like. Now it's really fun because they will try to organize the cells so that the same pollen is going into the same cell. So you may see pollen that's blue. You may see pollen that's really light yellow. And usually they're in the same cell, but they're not being mixed together. Now, you were asking about like what they do when they have just nectar. So there are going to be plenty of flowers that at a certain stage they're producing more nectar than they are pollen. And so they'll use their proboscis and then like just dip it in and then get some of their nectar. So people, can be purists and then they can, just have their bees forage. And pretty much in our area, they can forage all year round. Or we have pretty much like flowers and trees that are blooming. People still irrigate their plants in their yards, so they can find almost any type of pollen and nectar, though the type of things that they're collecting from will vary throughout the year, but you really don't have to feed your bees sugar water. And that's what some people will do. You could technically give your bees just a bunch of like sugar water and they'll be able to make honey out of that, but you don't have to. But they can just suck that up just like they would any other type of nectar. That's it, just up close and personal. It's just like pretty much just like a straw. They're just like sucking it out of the plants. And then they'll come back to the hive and then they'll give some of that, well, they'll give the nectar to another bee and then they'll deposit it. And as it's going through the honey stomach and it's being exchanged between bees, there's different bacteria that are being added to that honey because the honey can be fermented at stages. So that's why if you're not careful, your honey will actually ferment if it's not allowed to dehydrate quickly because there are bacteria in there. And you'll start to see the difference. Like this is a collection of honey with some pollen intermixed between it. An ideal situation if you're trying to collect honey is that you have just honeycomb, and we'll see this in a minute, a frame of just honeycomb with honey in it versus like if you were to collect this and try to eventually harvest it, it would taste a little bit sour just because you had some pollen or some bee bread in it. So those are some things to think about when you're collecting. It's everyone's preference. Some people like the idea of having maybe a little bit more sour taste. But the most important thing is if you're seeing nectar like this, which is nectar in open cells, it has not been covered yet. This is something, if you want, you can eat it right away, but it's not something you can store because the sugar content is not high enough for it to be safely stored without fermenting. Okay. And maybe I'll just mention this just to make sure everyone does know. Of course, if you want to be just careful when you're giving any honey to someone else. And best practices, we always talk about this, is that no infant, so someone under 12 months of age should never have honey because it can have botulism toxin in it. And botulism is something, that's treatable, but it can be deadly. So no children under 12 months of age should ever have any honey. So if you give it to someone, just make sure they're aware of that because every once in a while we have someone who's not aware and that becomes a medical problem. Okay, so here's the honey. When it's actually dehydrated to the point that it could be stored safely, the bees know, and they'll cover it with a layer of wax. All the other little cells that are not covered means that it's not quite dehydrated enough. So if you were to take a look at a frame, if you were just looking at this, you want your frame to be close to, say, if possible, 100%. But maybe you could get by with 90% of the cells covered, but this would not be ready to be harvested yet because there's too many open cells here and you wouldn't have a sugar content that's high enough. So this would ferment fairly quickly. Now, if you wanted to take this and chew on it, if you wanted to give it to someone, like within a week, it'd probably be fine. But you wouldn't be able to have this stored long term. Now, you can technically put it in the refrigerator and it'd probably be okay for a while. But again, if you can, just let your bees, finish their job and things will go a lot better. All right. Does anyone have questions about the anatomy? Because we're going to go on to some parts about the bees and their bee development in the hive. We're good? Okay, I'm going to keep on going. All right, so we're going to now talk about the bees and how they're creating the honeycomb and what they're doing with the honeycomb in a little bit more detail. So we'll just take a look at this particular picture. So again, you want to get an idea. As soon as you see this, this speaks of new beehive or, this is definitely a frame that's relatively new. It's not the newest because it looks a little yellow and there's little bits of brownness in areas. So this is probably honeycomb that's maybe 1 to 2 months old, potentially even 3 to 4 months old. New honeycomb, which we'll see in a little bit, is completely white. But because it's a little bit yellow, we know that it's aged a little bit. You can also see when there's these little brown bits, it's starting to break down a little bit, meaning that the honeycomb, when it's very new, is very soft. It's very malleable. And as it breaks, the bees are very good at making sure that the integrity of the hexagon shapes are intact. And the way that they do that, if they see a little piece that's broken, they don't just create new honeycomb. They'll actually start to mend it with propolis. And propolis is going to be, it's going to be sticky. It's going to seal things. It's going to mend things. And it's developed with multiple different things that the bees collect. But the idea is that the bees will collect resin. And so you may see resin that is coming from trees sometimes, like the most common one would be like a conifer. So like any of the pine trees, they'll collect some resin from those trees, and then they'll mix it with some other chemicals that they make from their body. And then they'll be able to mend this particular areas that look brownish and they become hard. Okay, so we'll take a look at when they've done more of that in a little bit. But this is what it looks like when they've actually are excreting the honeycomb. I've actually never, this is not my picture. I haven't been able to actually see this. And I'm always trying to see it. So the chances of seeing this is that when they're building new honeycomb. So that's going to be when you put your nuke or your new bees into your hive. If you have a frame and you're using foundationless, meaning you just have an open frame in a Langstroth hive. And also this is the same case for top bar hives. You just put a bar of wood in your hive. They need to build the honeycomb. And so all that new honeycomb they're going to produce from their bodies. And so if you're going to get a chance to see this, you're going to see them in their beehive. And I don't have a picture of this right now. They're going to start attaching to each other. You probably saw them hanging onto each other. And when they hang onto each other, that's called festooning. And they're creating a plumb line by hanging off each other. And they're going to then start to create the honeycomb within that chain of bees. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's where you could potentially see a bee making some wax. They'll pull this off their body, they'll mold it, and then they're going to make their honeycomb. This is the honeycomb that we saw before, and now they've started to use this particular frame for something. Does anyone know if this is honey or is this brood?
Brew.
Brood.
It's
Perfect.
brew.
What's the clue that it's brewed?
It's close.
Yes, it's closed,
Color.
and it's also opaque. Opaque meaning you can't see through it, because they'll close honey that's ready to be stored. They'll also close those, but it will look different, and you want to get used to the difference. There is a little bit of comparison down in this bottom right hand corner. You'll see that they put some nectar, and there's a few different little cells that have been closed here, but that's nectar, and that's honey, I should say. It's honey. So you can see it's more translucent in this lower right hand corner versus it's opaque. You really can't see through it. And that's going to be the bee brood. Now, does anyone know if this is like female or male?
It's female.
Female, yeah, exactly. How can you tell?
It's a flat surface as opposed to the male, which have a little bump out.
Exactly. Exactly. And you can even tell if this was a hive that had gone queenless and all of these were empty, you'll also start to get the idea when you look at frame, whether that was previously female or previously male brood cells. And that's because the cells are going to be smaller for the females, they're going to be larger for the males. Okay, and that'll be something you'll just see after a while when you see them. And I have some side-by-side pictures, so you'll be able to see the difference between that. But sometimes you'll just be able to pull up a frame and go, oh yeah, that's that's going to be drone brood. That's like very quickly. Now the other thing to look at when you're looking at this frame is the pattern of the brood. So the one thing is, it's kind of, there's like a lot of little holes in it. A perfect brood pattern would be it's almost completely covered. There's every single cell has a bee that's developing, and maybe there's like less than 10 holes within the brood pattern. So this is like an okay queen. It's not the best queen ever, because a lot of those like eggs that she's laying are not developing into bees that are going to survive. So this is an okay. It's good. It's not great. Just by looking at that pattern. Now here's the contrast when you're trying to look at just looking at the honeycomb, you can see how dark this is. So a lot of times when you're seeing honeycomb in a lot of the hives in the South 40, in the bee sanctuary, actually look like this. They're very old hives. And there's a couple of things to think about when you're looking at this. So one, quick glance, it's going to be for pollen, but it could also be for female or worker brood because the cells are smaller. You can see there are areas that maybe look a little bit lighter at the top and then darker at the bottom. But in general, this is a majority is going to be protein. It's not going to be wax. It's going to be propolis that's laid down. And the other thing to think about when you're seeing something that's this old is that in general, if you want to collect wax for things, there's going to be some wax that you could collect from a frame like this if you wanted to like use it. But just be aware that a lot of times when you start to see really dark frames like this, if you're doing foundationless, so it's a frame where you're letting the bees build their own honeycomb, if it's become this dark, a lot of people are concerned that it's old and that the bees have been foraging. And in general, people use pesticides and other chemicals in their yards, so that this particular frame could have a lot of chemicals in it. So if you're going to be collecting wax for, say you want to make chapstick or any lotions that you want to have as gifts, I'd avoid doing that with this type of honeycomb. You want to use as much as possible fresher honeycomb. Like something like this would be great for collecting and harvesting. So sometimes if you're trying to harvest for something as a gift, you can like just put new frames in and let the bees collect the wax, or you can just buy it from someone. If you buy it from someone, you just want to find out, the type of beekeeping that was done with the honeycomb, just so that you know, because there's still a lot of people who are selling wax that are from like commercial hives where they're using a lot of chemicals. So you can just expect that there would be chemicals in that beeswax. And I think most people would be pretty like hopefully honest with you, because you can make a lot of products that aren't going to go on your body that don't that you can use like any kind of wax for. Okay. I brought up this picture just to show you a little bit more. This is kind of an in-between. It's not super light, it's not super dark. And so this is a hive that could be a year old. And it looks like it's doing really well. This is also a majority of some okay brood pattern here. You can see a lot of holes that are being left. And when you take a look at a frame, if it's a brood frame, you'll see that the brood is being laid in the center, and they're always going to leave the edges for pollen and for nectar. So always see a ring around your brood, and that area is going to be for to feed those brood. Okay. The other thing that I wanted to point out on this particular frame is the top of the frame is up here, and you can see they've started to build some honeycomb here. So you just want to be cognizant of that, because you have frames side by side. And if you take a look at it, the frame is going to be a little bit wider at the top than at the bottom. And you want those frame tops to be able to sit right next to each other, if possible. Okay. So they start to get really close to each other. If they start to build wax, one is that maybe the frame is too far apart, and they're going to start to bridge those frames with wax. And so what will happen is that they'll start to attach the frames together, so it'll be really hard to pull them apart. The other thing is that if they start to have too much wax on the edges, they don't fit closely enough, and then it starts to get really hard to fit your frames in. So a lot of times when I start to see wax up at the top, I'll always just kind of scrape that off and try to just every once in a while do a little bit of hive maintenance by just cleaning up the tops of your frames. If you see the frame is starting to get like a little out pouch here, you may see this right here. It looks like the honeycomb is coming out from the frame. You want to like kind of scrape that off as much as possible, because once they start to like attach the frames to each other, it makes an inspection really hard, because now you're breaking honeycomb, and they don't like it when you break honeycomb, especially if it's like a frame that has any honey in it. If you start to have to break the honeycomb that's attaching two frames, honey starts spilling, and they start getting a little bit more agitated because they really feel like someone's disturbing the hive. So these are little things that you can take care of on just like your inspection that will prevent future problems. Okay, this is a picture, and then it has a queen in it. You can't really see the queen that well, but I did think it was kind of fun to see. She's laid her wings on top of each other. This other bee has laid its wings on top of each other. This is a pollen frame. Other than that, you just start to see like different types of frames. And then a lot of people ask, like, should they mark their queen? So this is a marked queen. They've just taken a little paint pen and like marked the top of her. And there's a few reasons why people do that. Some people will do it because they just want to be able to see the queen a little bit more easily. The paint color indicates the year that queen was raised. And so there's a series of colors that is accepted in terms of like what color you would paint your queen. You can also just make sure, like if you're getting a queen from someone else, a lot of people will mark the queen just so that you can like see that the queen is there in the nuke. But you don't have to mark your queen. You can identify her. Once you start to get used to seeing her, it'll be a lot easier in the future. Did anyone get to see a queen on Saturday?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Excellent.
It was very exciting.
Yeah. Well, was it easy to see her?
Yeah, they both were quite large.
Okay. All right.
It wasn't easy because it seemed like she would hide, or the bees would try to hide her. But then once you could see her, then the abdomen was significantly longer.
That's that's a really good point. Is the queen does wind up hiding more than the other bees. And so some people, if you're trying to figure out if your queen is in there, some people, what they'll do is they'll have a separate box off to the side. And when you inspect a frame, you put that frame into the next box or the other box. And then you inspect the next frame and then you put it into the other box. Because if you keep on putting, even if you inspected a frame and you said, oh, she's not there, and you put it back down, she could crawl over to that frame. So if you're trying to, if you're really making it like you're like, oh, I don't know if this has a viable queen or not, you will want to try to make sure that you have a separate box so that you can inspect every frame and know that she hasn't crawled over by crawling underneath. So because she will like try to hide. Okay, all right. So this is a frame with a bunch of bees. Does anyone see a drone? So the male bee.
Yes.
Yeah, where is that drone?
It's like off to the center, like a
Oh,
little bit, third of the way up.
Yeah, do other people see it?
yeah. He's facing left.
Yeah, exactly. So again, it's a little bit about just seeing these bees. Like it's a very good indicator of what stage your hive is in by knowing how many drones you have. So you see a drone that's right here, kind of, a little bit towards the top. And when you see the drone, it just has these big bee eyes. They're like touching each other. They're almost like right up next to each other here. The abdomen looks very large. And the thorax looks very large. So everything's large. Now, the thing that's interesting about the drones is that the reason why they're there is really just for in case they need to make a new queen and the queen needs to mate. So in the wintertime, you can have a particular hive that has 0 drones. They'll take all the drones and they will kill them all so that they don't live through the winter and they don't have to feed them because the drones live within the hive until they're needed for mating. And so they pretty much just feed and kind of like, they don't go out and forage. They don't really do anything. They can't protect the hive because they don't have a stinger. And so they're there only to make sure that the hive can survive if the queen needs to mate. And so when you start to see drones emerging within a hive, that's an indication that one, it's just springtime. So they're just preparing in case they might need to have the queen mates. Or sometimes if you start to see a lot of them and you start to see like swarm cells, which are queen cells, it may be that the hive is getting ready to swarm. So it's good to just get an idea of how many drones are in your hive at any one time. The other thing that can happen when you start to have a lot of drones is that you could have a hive that's become queenless because a drone is an unfertilized egg. And so what can happen is if you have a queen that's no longer laying fertilized eggs, sometimes you can have a worker bee that starts to lay. And the worker bees cannot lay fertilized eggs. They have not mated. And so all those unfertilized eggs will become drones. And so if you start to see a whole bunch of drones, it's also probably not a good sign. You should see like maybe 300 drones, maybe 1,000 drones at the most. But if you start to see like half the bees are drones, there's something that's off because they should be mostly worker bees and foragers. And again, if you look at this this pattern here for the brood, this is worker brood. It's flat, it's small, but there's a lot of holes. There's probably more holes than there are actual capped brood. And so this is a hive that's not doing very well right now. And your queen bees won't lay forever. So they will lay for years, but some queens will lay maybe for a few months. For whatever reason, they never became great layers, but some bees can be queens that lay for like up to 10 years is the thought. But a lot of people say the average is probably 5 to 6 years. And the only way you would know that is if you marked your queen, because you can't tell necessarily sometimes you can miss a queen cell here and there if you're not fully expecting your hive. So if you want to know how old your queen is, you really need to mark her with the appropriate color. All right. I brought this up because I didn't have a great picture of a queen with a court, but I figured this kind of almost looks like it. So this is honeycomb that's been broken, and all the bees have come to, like just clean up some of the honey that's spilled. But the thing that's kind of interesting is you can see that they're kind of almost in a semicircle here. That kind of semicircle or a circle of bees is another way to find a queen, because there's always a set of bees that are considered the court, and that court will be around the queen at all times. And they're doing several things. One, they're cleaning her because her job is really to lay eggs. So she doesn't have time to eat. She doesn't have time to groom herself. She has a court of bees that are doing that. So you'll see a little ring of bees, their heads are towards her, and you'll see that they're just like kind of, either nibbling or kind of grooming her, but they could also be transferring nectar or honey to her because she's eating as she's working throughout the hive. The other thing that might be of interest to people is you can see in this upper right hand corner a little bee butt. That means that the bee is either cleaning that, or if you smoke the hive, which probably this was from an inspection, it probably means that they were drinking some nectar because they smelled the smoke and they were preparing to like try to move that nectar to another location. Okay, and these are all females. And this is because it looks a little bit translucent, that's the other indication that this is going to be capped honey. Okay. Now, in contrast to this picture where you can see like maybe 30% of this is uncapped and then the other half is capped, this is a perfect frame for, harvesting honey. It is pretty much almost 100% capped. There's maybe a little bit here, and part of this down here towards the middle of the bottom is probably like just crushed from pulling up the frame. But this would be the perfect one. You could do cut comb from this. We talk about cut comb when you want to actually take the comb, give it to someone, or take it yourself, and you want to chew on it because it's fresh, fresh wax. So it'd be okay to digest it. If it was like really dark, like this one, you would not want to chew on this. There's probably going to be a lot of chemicals in that from just the bees harvesting from other people's yards where they use chemicals. So I wouldn't chew this. You could harvest the honey from it, but I probably would not try to chew that. But this is the perfect setup for doing cut comb. Okay, looks good. That looks perfect. Right now I'm just admiring it because it looks so good. Okay. Now, does anyone know if they're going to be using foundation for their hives? Does anyone know what foundation is?
My my nucleus box came with foundation for my frame, so I do have that to use, and I assembled it using it. So any strategies using foundation are greatly appreciated.
Okay. Do you know what kind of foundation it is? Is it wax based?
It's a black coloration.
Oh,
That
is it
helps.
plastic? Yeah, it sounds like then it's plastic.
It might be.
Okay, is it like completely black or it's
Yes.
completely white?
It seems like black with almost like a wax coating.
Yeah, you can have wax coated plastic foundation. So that's better than just plastic. So there's different kinds. So foundation is going to be a layer that's in the frame to help guide the bees when they're making their wax. So there's a few different benefits of having foundation in a frame. So you could buy a frame, it could be empty, it could have wires in it. It could have foundation, which is going to be a flat sheet that has usually some imprint of honeycomb like this. You can see this is like looking through like new honeycomb, and you can see that there's the hexagon shapes, and the hexagon shapes on one side are slightly off than the hexagons on the other side, and that provides some stability. But we can actually see the center of one cell here, and it lines up with like the other on the other side of the other, like the other side of the frame, I should say, or the other side of the foundation. So the foundation, and this is the one biggest reason if people want to use foundation, is it keeps the bees laying down wax and building within the frame. Because the one hard thing about doing foundationless, meaning it's just an open frame, is sometimes they won't create a straight piece of wax, or I should just say wax, within the frame. Sometimes they'll cross over. So one frame has, multiple different like frames in it. What's it, like sheets of wax in it, if that makes any sense. If ideally you have one frame you pull out and it's got a nice, pretty set of wax in it. If this was crossing over 3 different frames, it would be really hard. You could technically pull out 3 frames at once if they're crossing over, but it makes the whole situation a lot harder to work with. So that's the number one reason to use foundation. Now, if you get plastic, a lot of times bees won't naturally get to plastic, but if it's coated with wax, that helps a lot because they'll like lay down a little bit easier on that. Some people, if they want to have cut comb, so like this would be for cut comb. So if you had a plastic foundation here, you would not be able to cut pieces of comb out of your frame because there's a piece of wax in the middle. So what some people will do is they will use a foundation frame, and then they'll do an empty frame, and then they'll do a foundation frame, and then an empty frame. And so there's a guide to keep all of the wax within the frame, but you can have one that's in between that will be guided by the foundation on either side. I don't know if that made sense, but there's all different ways that you can use foundation to like guide things. Now there are some different like opinions about foundation. So foundation is always built with the idea, well, I shouldn't say always. So you can have foundation that's set up for drones, or foundation that's set up for what's it called? For like workers.
Workers.
So thank you. So the thing is that those cells, the imprint is going to be bigger or smaller. Now, drone size cells are bigger. They actually are really great for honey. So sometimes they'll put honey into very like big cells. So you can try to guide them to build more honey frames by having a larger printed foundation. So there's all different ways that you can use foundation to kind of, optimize what you're trying to do within your hive. Or you could just be completely foundationless and then let the bees do whatever they want. I will also mention, if there's different thoughts about whether you should have like a deep frame. So that's like a deeper box versus a shorter box. So like this particular frame is a deep frame. So if you're trying to cut comb out of it, this is great because you have a lot to work with. Some people don't like a deep box filled with honey because it's just heavier, so there's different things to think about when you're trying to like guide your bees to like create honey. A box that's 10 frames with this type of honey is going to weigh, it could weigh like 60 pounds. So you want to think about what you are trying to get out of the hive so that you can know how to set it up. Like you may want this, but you don't want it to be heavy. So you might want to use a box that has 8 frames instead of 10. It'll be a lot lighter. Technically, it'll be 20% lighter. So there's a lot of things to consider. Is this too much information or is this okay?
Okay.
Okay, I'm throwing out a lot of random stuff, but there's like so much to like talk about with every single picture. But this is going to be super heavy, but it's going to be super yummy if you like honey.
So Roberta, for that frame, that full frame without the foundation, how long would that take them to fill that?
Oh,
and
wow.
To build the foundation themselves?
To build and to fill it. So that's a great question. So the biggest, there's like 2 factors. So one is how big is your hive, like how many bees are in it. And then the second factor is what stage of the season you're in. So let's say we have a huge hive. Let's say you have 60,000 bees. You're running a hive that's like 4 deep boxes. They could fill that like within a month. They could probably build it pretty fast. If it's your first year and you got like 20,000 bees, they may never fill a whole frame like that the whole season. So it can really vary depending on the size. So that's why when I was trying hard to like really build up a hive, and I was doing completely foundationless, because it takes a lot of work to build up a whole foundation and build new honeycomb from scratch. That's why I wound up combining lots of swarms. You know, when you catch a swarm, it could be, some of those small swarms are like 6,000 bees. If you want 60,000 bees, at the beginning of the, you know, springtime, you've got to like add a whole bunch of swarms together. And it can really like make a huge difference. So there's a lot of ways around, like, you know, getting up and running quickly. So a lot of people will buy a nuke. And if you buy a nuke, that nuke's going to be usually like 4 to 5 frames. It will probably, if you wanted to be really kind to that hive, you would let them build for the first year and not even collect any honey. Maybe you'll collect 1 medium frame, but if you really want them to be able to build, if you're starting foundationless, they would need at least a year to build up without any added help.
Thank you.
Yeah, and it also depends on how good your queen is. If you can catch what's called the nectar flow. So nectar flow is usually after a bunch of rain and the flowers are starting to bloom. So that's why around end of January, if we get a lot of rain during the winter time, and then it warms up a little bit quickly at the beginning of February, end of January, that's usually what's going to wind up being a nectar flow time. And what you'll see is you'll just see the bees going in and out super fast, because the queen starts laying as soon as there's evidence that there's more stores in terms of food that's available, and they can sense when the foragers are bringing back more nectar, because the first thing they'll get is nectar, and then they'll start to get pollen, you know, because like pollen you think of as like springtime, but you can actually generate a lot of nectar at the beginning before you start to see all that pollen. So if some people will even use like pollen counts, but technically you can see pollen so easily with your bees by just looking at the entrance. You'll be able to get an idea like, oh yeah, like the flowers are blooming. And yeah, that's probably the best indication of that. Okay, so the reason why I'm showing this wasn't actually to talk about foundation, but it was to show where the center of the cell is, because it's important to know where the center of the cell is so that you know where to look for eggs. So this is going to be the next thing that we're going to talk about. The way that the queen lays an egg is she takes her abdomen and she puts it all the way down to the bottom of the cell. And so you can think about it as her abdomen is just set up to go straight to the bottom, and she will lay at that very little cross between those 3 little areas at the bottom of the cell right here, and she will then lay the egg so it's stuck to that little spot, and then she'll pull up her abdomen and the egg will just stay standing up. Okay, so that's an important indication, if you can see that egg at the center, that the queen is laying appropriately. Now if you see more than 1 egg, that is not a queen that's laying regularly yet. So that's one possibility. So you may see 2 eggs in a cell when you have a new queen. You may see, you know, maybe a cell has an egg and the next one doesn't have an egg. Like she doesn't know what she's doing quite yet. Technically, you should see egg, 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 and you'll actually see it in a little like circle. And we'll take a look at that. I think I might have a picture of that. If you start to see eggs, but they're on the side of the cell, because remember the queen has a very long abdomen. That's how she's able to get her abdomen all the way to the bottom of the cell. It's long. A new queen that hasn't mated and doesn't have a lot of eggs, her abdomen's not going to be very big. And so she may have trouble laying eggs right in the center. But if you have eggs and you can actually see them at the edge or even on the side of the cell, then it means that you probably have a queenless or a queen that's no longer laying, and a worker bee has now started to lay. So we call it a laying worker bee. So you'll see multiple little eggs on the side of the cell, and then you need to figure out how to get your hive a new queen. All right. I should try to get some pictures of that someday. All right, so again, this is what it looks like. The queen puts her abdomen down. She's gonna lay the egg right at that area where these cross. And then she's gonna lift it up, and then the egg's gonna be deposited, and it should stand straight up. It should look like a little piece of rice that's translucent. The worker bees are gonna start to give some royal jelly to these eggs. They're going to start to develop. They're going to become larvae. The larvae are going to get larger and larger. They'll look like little seeds, little pudgy seeds. And then eventually, when the larva is large enough and it's been fed enough, it will then metamorphosize. When it's ready to metamorphosize, the worker will then put a cap, and then you'll start to see the bees metamorphosize. And they will look white, and they will start to have their little like bee parts and insect parts. And it is interesting if you wind up, having a hive and you accidentally break some larva that's being developed, you'll actually get to see it. And it's a little bit between a alien looking species it's really unusual. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend trying to like open up a metamorphosizing bee cell, but it can be very interesting if it happens by accident. You should take advantage of looking at it closely. And then what'll happen is the bee will develop, and then it starts, in a sense, like wakes up and will want to emerge. And so what it'll do, it'll start to chew off the cap itself. And I don't know if you've seen like an egg hatch or something, but when you have something that's a circular cap, you need to actually chew it in different little areas so the bee will start to turn inside. And it also helps to release itself from the cell, because if you just try to pull the bee out, it's actually kind of stuck to the wax because the wax is already kind of sticky. So it kind of rotates, it chews the cap off, and once it's chewed all the way around, then it can come and it will come out, but usually another bee will try to help it. So some of the nurse bees will pull it out because it is stuck in there. Okay, so this is what it looks like when a drone is trying to emerge. So you start to see this, and you'll see this on the frames. You probably already saw this, is that you'll see them start to like kind of wiggle their way out of the comb. All right, and then this is just a little bit of what people will call bee math sometimes. So it's a way of kind of understanding what you should see over the lifetime of a new hive. So you have workers, you have drones, and you have your queen bee. And then these numbers are how long they stay in each one of these stages. So they all have the same length of time in the egg stage, 3 days. And then they start to differ a little bit in terms of the larval stage. I don't know if these things are true, but I will just postulate. So like some of these things take a little bit longer, like the pupal stage for a larger bee is 14 days, but why does a queen take so much less time than the worker bee to develop? I'm not 100% sure. The thought is like the queen bee is given a lot more royal jelly, so it has more nutrients. So it's just working with more nutrients to begin with, so it develops faster. So the total number of days is actually only 16 for a queen, 24 for a drone, and then 21 for a worker. Now, one thought is, and this kind of comes up sometimes, is like someone will say, like, I bought an Italian queen, and now I don't think I have Italian bees anymore. I think I have, Sculata bees from Africa or something. And so one of the things, and a majority of our kind of wild honeybees that we have, so they're not native bees, they're just wild bees. So we have a lot of wild honeybees, the Apis mellifera. And so they will have a slight difference in the number of days the drones take to emerge. So one of the thoughts is that if you had a beehive that had mixed genetics of some sort, the drones that are Sculata will actually emerge slightly earlier, And so they have a better chance of mating with the queen. That's the thought about why sometimes you'll have drift of from one species to another within in a particular hive. Because if you think about how a queen mates, a queen will come out of a hive and she will fly, and then she will be mating with drones that are from other hives from say 2 to 3 miles away, maybe 5 miles away. And so they can be coming from all kinds of different like hives with different genetics. And so your queen can wind up laying eggs of different, you know, mixture of genetic material. So you can always try to like buy a queen that's Italian, but in general around here, you're going to wind up having a mixture of bees. And that's why I should mention this. That's why some people do wind up buying queens every year. Is they want a certain type of bee in their beehive. Okay. Okay. So this is one of those eggs. Did people get to see eggs when they inspected?
I think I saw some, but I wasn't sure if that's what it was or not.
Okay. Okay.
People-
Yeah, it is what. Oh, what was that?
People I was with said they could see them, but they're so small, it's hard for me to see them.
Yeah, they're pretty small. Anyone else have trouble seeing? There are some tricks to being able to see them. So I'll show you a couple of tricks. One is to make sure that the sun is always shining onto the honeycomb. All right, so you want the sun behind you. You don't want the sun in your eyes. You want it behind you. And then you want to hold your honeycomb up at eye level with the sun coming over your shoulder. Okay, that will make it easier for you to be able to see at the bottom of the cell. The other thing is if you're having trouble seeing, you want to kind of move your frame back and forth a little bit to be able to get different angles. And sometimes that can help. Because the one nice thing about seeing eggs, and the reason why you want to see eggs is one, you want to make sure it's right dead center so that you have a queen that's laying well, because it's way easier to see eggs than it is to find your queen. As long as you can see the eggs, you know you have a laying queen. And that's the key to having a hive that's going to survive. The one thing is also if you start to see it, it's that kind of just that visual process of recognizing what it looks like. It'll make it easier the next time. Same with the queen. Once you see the queen once, usually it's easier the next time. So if you can, and sometimes it's also hard if it's hard to see just because it's just hard to see, you could have a magnifying glass. That's something else that you can use to make it easier to see the eggs. And if you're trying to inspect your hive to make sure that you have a laying queen, you can also take a picture with your phone, and then you can magnify it later on to be able to identify where the eggs were. Because sometimes also when there's a lot of bees flying around, it's just hard to see. So you can use those tools, video, or take a picture of your frames. And the type of frames that you want to take a picture of are going to be the frames that have larvae. Okay, because one, you want to make sure that you start to get used to, is this drone or is this worker cell size? Actually, this at first kind of looks a little bit big, so not 100% sure. This could be drone actually. When you take a look at it, the thing that you can see is the larvae are a different size. So actually, in general, this means that the queen is not perfect in terms of how she's laying, because if you were to look at this, if she had laid one cell at a time in a little like circle around the frame, they would all be getting slightly smaller as you get from the bigger ones to the smaller ones. But you can see that a little bit here. They're bigger over here, they're smaller over here. If you see smaller larvae, if you keep on following them, you're going to see them get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And then there's the egg. I don't know if you see the egg. It's right there. It's got a little bit of a crush right there, but you can see they're bigger up here, they're smaller down here, and they get even smaller. It's just royal jelly with a little C, a tiny C, a tinier C, a tiny C. Maybe that's a little bigger. And then it's hard to see what's in this one. And then the egg's right here. It's sticking up. It's just a little crushed. That's why it doesn't look like it's exactly in the center. So that's a trick to try to find the eggs. Just keep on following them to the smaller and till they get smaller and smaller and smaller. And you'll eventually wind up with an egg usually. All right. Oh, that's it. A little bit up close and personal. That's it. It's not on the side. It's just crushed. So you can see it. And again, you can see the tiny little larva here that's swimming in the royal jelly. So the queen gets more royal jelly, but everyone gets a little bit of royal jelly in a sense. Yeah, these look really cool. Okay. All right. So I guess that was worker because the right side is the picture we were just looking at. And so I put these side by side because on the right side is going to be the worker brood, and on the left side is going to be the drone brood. So cell size smaller for the workers, larger for the drones. And then the drones have this characteristic kind of little pop on the top, a little dome, okay, because they're bigger. So if you see these little domes, that's going to be drones. If all you see are little domes, then you know you have a lame worker bee and that your hive's not doing well. And you can see how flat it is over here. So flat, domed, okay? New comb on the left, older comb on the right because it's darker. Okay. Okay, all right, this is a queen cell. And you don't always get to see a queen cell that's open. So this is kind of like a frame that's kind of on its side. A lot of times what we'll do is we'll call it like a peanut. It almost kind of looks like a peanut. It's kind of long, it's a little bit rounded. The thing that's unusual here is it actually has the cap off. So you can see that the queen has emerged. A lot of times you may not see this cap because usually once the queen has emerged, they'll take the cap off and they'll reserve that for if they need a queen in the future. And they'll actually break this down so that it's only a queen cup. Okay, so queen cups are the beginnings of a queen cell, and they're usually at the edge or at the bottom of your cell, of your frame. You can see them on the sides. So Jamie in the sanctuary actually found this frame. It's kind of blurry, but this is a queen cell. This is a queen cell. This is a queen cell. This thing had probably like 20 queen cells on just one side of the frame. Now, there's a lot of things that you can do with this if you catch it in time. So none of these have emerged. They're all closed. So there's a bee that's metamorphosizing. That bee does not need any more nutrients. Technically, you could take one of these cells, you could cut it off, and you could put it into another hive that needs a queen. That would be the fun thing to do. You know, some people will take this out and they don't want so this is like, they would call them swarm cells. So this hive may be getting ready to swarm. So they're making a lot of new queens with the idea that a queen's going to fly off with part of the hive. Another queen's going to fly off with another part of the hive. And so a lot of people will take these and you can remove this whole frame and some people will just kill them, you know. So there's a lot of things you can do if you are able to catch this. Now, if we remember our bee math told us that our queens are going to emerge in 16 days. So if you inspect your hive every month, you could potentially miss that you had a new queen and that your hive was ready to swarm. So that's the only thing that's really tricky about queens is they develop very quickly. So if you're not like routinely like checking your hive, there's a lot of times you could miss when your hive was ready to swarm. That's just something to consider. It's the tricky part about the queen. She develops so quickly. But this is a perfect time to be able to catch a queen and then split this. So if you are ever able to catch this and you see a queen cell that's being developed, but you still have a queen that looks like she's laying, you could technically split this into another hive, and now you've got two hives. So, because it'll like have a queen that emerges. That's the thing that's kind of fun is you can play around a lot if you have a hive that you're inspecting a lot. So that's called splitting a hive. If you have it create a new one, a whole new colony. But this is kind of fun to see. And this is one that I found in my hive. So this is actually a pretty new hive. You can see it hasn't even filled this frame. This was probably after 3 months. And for some reason, after just a few months, they decided to make a new queen. So they created this little queen cell. And within 2 weeks, it was open and the queen was gone. And they had actually removed everything here. And the only reason that I caught this was because I was taking some pictures of it and I wanted to see how it looked over, that 2 to 3 month period when a hive is developing very quickly. And so I was inspecting it every week. So I just happened to catch this because I had seen the queen cup and I assumed that the queen cup was being made for like a year from now. I didn't realize that they were planning on actually making the queen like that soon because usually your queen should do well. Now, if the queen didn't mate and that queen just wasn't, healthy, there's a lot of good reasons why they may need another queen. The other thing that was really interesting about this hive was there was a lot of genetic variety within the bees. I don't know if you can see, a majority of these bees kind of have like these orange bands on them, but there's actually a lot of bees that were kind of almost black here and here and here. So there's a lot of variety here. And I think variety is always good to see. So, and I don't think I see any like drones. And I don't think I see the queen here. But they are making a new one. Okay, that was it. That was everything. I think we covered a lot. Did anyone want to talk about or ask questions about any of the previous slides? Pictures? Funness.
I did have one question with regards to splitting. If you were to catch those queen cells in time, what would be the, I guess, appropriate procedure? Or would you remove frames from the active hive and prevent them from returning in lieu of those queens hatching?
That's a great question. There's like multiple topics in that. So, like, Connor, were you the one who said you had a nuke?
Yes, I have a newly assembled nuke, so I'm waiting for an opportunity to rescue some bees.
Oh, okay. It wasn't a nuke that came with a queen and foragers.
No.
Oh, okay, gotcha. Okay. So like if you were to buy a nuke that had bees in it, there's a couple different things. Usually what they'll do is they'll put in at least 2 frames of brood, and then they'll put a frame on either side that has honey and pollen in it. And that would be a good start to a small hive. So that's like kind of a typical nuke. And so if you were to try to like split your hive, you would take usually a couple of worker bee brood frames, put that with your queen, and then you would give it some pollen and some nectar. And that would be your new nuke. Now you could put that in an area that is right next to your other hive. You can try to do that, but you'll have to do maybe a little bit of like finagling because the workers and the foragers are going to like, if the foragers leave, they'll come back. They'll always come back to that same other hive. So that's the thing that's a little bit tricky. So sometimes what people will do is, depending on how big your hive is, you can actually take the old hive that's big, move it to the side, and put your new hive that you're trying to create, that split, and put it where the big hive used to be. And so the foragers will naturally start to like come to that spot, and you can maybe have 2 hives next to each other. There's a debate as to whether you should have hives very close to each other, should you have them very far. Some people say if you're going to like try to create a nuke, you could even like take that and maybe you take it to the sanctuary, because they will like not come back, hopefully, depending on how far you live. They say like usually, isn't it like 3 feet or 3 miles? You have to have a big enough distance. If it's just a mile away, they will actually wind up coming back to the old hive site. If that makes any sense.
Thank
So
you.
you kind of have, yeah, there's a lot of stuff to finagle. Now you can actually split a hive, even if you didn't have a queen cell, and you just made sure you had eggs or larvae that looked like they were less than usually like 2 to 3 days old. And you can take those little eggs with say some brood and the honey, and then just split that off, and they will make a new queen from that, from those eggs, because they'll automatically know that there's no queen, and they'll try to make a new one. So that's another way people split.
Okay, very cool. Thank you for that.
Yeah, yeah. And at one time, we talked about doing a queen rearing session, and that's another way that you can kind of initiate that setup. So you can wind up putting like a whole bunch of queen cups, which are manufactured, on a top bar, and then put that in without a queen, and they will make queen cell, queen cell, queen cell, queen cell, queen cell, as long as they are queenless and they already have those cups available. They just like gravitate towards them.
I see.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting things to do. What other questions do people have?
So what is the difference between queen cups and swarm cells? Or are they the same?
I think in general, you can consider them to be the same. So they're going to generate a queen. Some people will call them a swarm cell, in the anticipation that they figure, and this is a little bit different. Like some people will say a swarm cell comes off the side of the comb, I should say it comes off the side here rather than the edge. Like the edges, people think that those queens are meant for repopulating that same hive, whereas if they come off the side, like this other picture, people think that those are more likely to be swarm cells. But a swarm cell is a queen cell.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. What other questions? We're actually almost at the 9 o'clock hour.
What do you recommend for just starting off? Like, how much room do you have to have in your yard to start, like, say, one box?
Wow, it's almost like you were planted for that question, because the other thing that we were going to talk about was setting up your bee yard. It's something that either, if someone had a specific question, we can even like tackle a bee yard today. Or the other thing that we do at the next meeting is, if you want, you can, we actually will take, like, if you want a Google picture, a satellite picture of your backyard, and then we can go, hey, what looks like it's a good spot, and we can look at where your neighbors are versus where your pathways are versus like other things that are in your backyard, and we can kind of maybe find an ideal spot, because you can have a beehive in, say, your what's that thing that's called on the side of your house? I think there's a name for it, but you know how like there's a small little area on the side of your house? You could technically have a hive there. You don't have to be able to walk on both sides of it. You could just be in front of it. So people have done that because it's kind of off to the side. It's a path that not, like if you pick one side that's not usually taken, that could be really nice. The thing I like about that one is I had someone, we set up their hive kind of in a spot that was right by their bedroom window. It was their kids' bedroom window. And so the kids could wake up and just see out their window the beehive. See, it was in a sense like an observation window. And so they always got to see them. They didn't have to get suited up. And they always had, some interaction with their bees without having to, disturb them.
Is there a particular direction that you want the hive to face?
People have this idea that your entrance should face south so that the bees can see the sun. And I think they don't really care that they see the sun. The sun's everywhere. Like when it's bright, it's bright. I think if you were in a cold area, I think that could be problematic. So I always think the most important thing in urban beekeeping is understanding the pathway of your bees, because you don't want to walk in front of them. You don't want people, you don't want your pets to walk in front of them. You don't want you know, a lot of bee activity near someone else's, like a neighbor's active area. So like if there's a like a play yard or something where the kids are going to be yelling and you know, making a lot of noise in an area that's maybe not the ideal place. Like if your bees get a little bit irritated, you don't want them stinging your neighbor's kids, you know. So those are kind of like the things to think about. It's more like the human interaction part of like what's important for placement, I think, more than anything. Now, there are places I would suggest you don't put your hive. So some places that are not good for a hive are damp, shaded areas. So let's say you have a backyard with a lot of really big trees, and that area never dries out. It's possible that your hive's going to be kind of wet and cold, and that's the thing that will kill your bees before anything else. It's just being wet and cold. There'll be like a little like ball of bees, and I've seen this a lot. And we actually get like more frost if you're in the Long Beach area. We actually get kind of cold, so that can be a problem. Someone put their beehive once kind of in a place so that you want to make sure that you have very solid footing for your beehive, because if it gets moist and there's a lot of rain or pooling of water, your beehive could start to sink. And if it's not level, that's another way that your bees wind up creating like comb that's not within the frames, because they just use the natural like plumb line to gravity. And if you're like off, they'll like totally mess up how they're building their comb. So if you can, you want to have it in some type of sun if possible. Now, you can have it in a shade, but there's all these things that you have to do. You have to manage the moisture more. You have to like lift your lid up when it rains and kind of make sure it's not getting moldy inside. But it's probably going to break down your frames faster than anything if your frames are just really wet all the time.
Thank you.
Yeah. So that would be probably the first thing that people should do is, you know, just make sure that you're on some type of even ground. So before you put your hive down, because once your hive is there and they've built up your hive, you can't fix it. Like if you're trying to mess around with 30,000 bees, it's not easy. So you want to do it really well to begin with, if possible. So if anyone wants to do like a kind of description of the backyard, you can, I don't know whose email. Do you have someone's email? You could email someone. I could put it in the chat if you want. Or if you just want to bring your picture, you can share your screen and then we can go over what your backyard looks like. And that's another way to be able to, you know, go over how your bee yard should be set up. Now, the other thing that some people will ask is, can I put it on my roof or something like that? Anyone want to put it on their roof?
Maybe.
Okay, we don't. Maybe, okay.
Yeah.
A roof can be okay. There's a couple of things, and probably there's 10 things to think about if you're going to put it on your roof. One is you should probably be able to get to your roof without having to use a ladder if possible. Because if you ever have to bring down your hive and it's full of bees, it's really hard to bring it down a ladder. So if there's some people have like, you know, almost like a deck on their roof, and that's something that has some stairs to get to it, that's like acceptable. But I would in general kind of avoid it because one, if your bees get mad and for some reason you have to move it like right away, it's challenging. The second thing is if you do decide to put it on your roof, you need to distribute the weight, because a full hive, say you have, say, 3 deep boxes, that hive could potentially weigh over 200 pounds, and you don't want those itty bitty little like feet if you're using certain types of like stands in small little areas on your roof. They're going to punch right through. So you have to distribute the weight. Usually people will put 2x4s under the base of the hive to distribute the weight over a bigger area. You have to also just make sure, usually you have to strap them, because usually any wind that gusts, you know, during storms is blocked by our the walls that are property lines. But if you have your hive up on a roof, it's not protected from higher gusts. So you have to make sure you have like ratchet straps that keep your lid on, or because I wouldn't even put like a rock on there. I'd probably ratchet strap it. Those are kind of the biggest thing. And then, then everyone knows you have a beehive if it's on your roof, because most people can see you. In general, if you're down in your backyard, a lot of people may never know that you even have a beehive. Okay, it's technically 9 o'clock. So we're all finished for today. If anyone had some other burning questions, I can stay on for a few minutes. But otherwise, I hope that you have a wonderful night and get a lot of rest.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was very informative.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was really great. Thank you.
Bye.
Great, thank you.
Roberta, I do have one other quick question. Are we going to be able to access? I see that it was recording. Are we going to be able to access this if we wanted to look at pictures?
Yes, so what we'll do is, and I'll see where Dee's putting the things. You can have the slide, like the presentation, and then we have a YouTube location, so we'll email you the link to the recording.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a wonderful night, Cindy.
Thank you. Good night.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye,
Bye.
everybody. Bye, Gabriel.
Good night, everyone.
Roberta, thank you so much. I wasn't planning on staying, but then
You stayed the whole
I
time.
stayed.
You
Because I
just
miss you.
love
I haven't
it.
seen you in forever. And I would,
Oh,
it's a good refresher and I always learn something from you. So I really appreciate it.
yay. I don't know if Dee can hear because I don't know I don't know where to put this. I could put it on the Notion site again. I can make another one. I could link the
Um,
recording there too.
Yeah, maybe that would be the thing to do. We could.
Okay, I won't be able to do right now. I still have to
Yeah.
finish my notes from work.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be right now. And we did have a couple people that weren't here. Cedric had to work, and then someone else, Kari. I sent her a text, but I didn't hear from her, so I'm not sure. But I'm sure they'd appreciate.
So that I'll do for sure. I'll be able to like download it and upload it tonight.
Okay.
And then I can send that out. But I think making a new Notion page, that might take me a while.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Just getting the recording would be great.
Yeah. What other fun stuff are you doing that I could help with? Are you guys good?
Oh, well, if you want to help, yeah, we need help.
What do you need
on
help? What do you need help with?
stuff. I don't know. Something.
No.
Yeah, let me think about it.
Here, let me like stop the recording. Hang on. Where did I put my recording button? Stop the recording. Stop the share. For all of you who are still on, have a good night and goodbye.